Precepts incense, samadhi incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, cloud of lighted incense pouring into the Dharma realms, offering to the highest teachers of the 10 directions. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all directions of space, all realms, past, present, and future, all Buddhas, the honored Dharma, the enlightened Sangha, the permanent 3 treasures. I respectfully bow to our own teacher Sakyamuni Buddha, the future-born Maitreya Buddha, great wisdom Manjushri Bodhisattva, great practice Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattvas, all the Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to the great love, great compassion, Amitabha Buddha of the Western Paradise, great compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great power, Siddhigarbha Bodhisattva, great power, Mahasthala Prabha Bodhisattva, all the Bodhisattvas in the great pure ocean. Well, good morning. It's nice to have you here. Lovely Sunday morning. Really beautiful here in DeLand. I hope it's beautiful wherever you are. Ramadan started a couple days ago, and I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge any of our Muslim brothers and sisters who listen to these talks. Happy to have you with us and like to wish you a blessed Ramadan month. And I might return to this theme a little bit during the next couple of weeks. You know, if the prisons weren't closed to volunteers right now, I'd be going to Tomoka Correctional Institution for Buddhist services on Tuesdays. And during Ramadan, we get there just about the time the Muslim services end. And I always get a chance to talk to some of the practitioners who are there. And I always enjoy that. We also have a few Muslims who attend Buddhist services. And I have to say, I admire the dedication that they have to their religious practice. It's not easy to go without food and water, especially water, all day long. You know, I don't know if you know, but Ramadan is we fast between sunrise and sunset all month. And that means taking in no food, no drink. And when you live in Florida and it gets to 90 degrees in the afternoon, that's pretty tough. And I have trouble keeping hydrated on hot days myself. And these guys live in these dorms with no air conditioning. And I don't know how they do it, especially when the calendar moves around. They use a different calendar than we do. And sometimes Ramadan happens in the middle of the summer and it's really, really hot. So Anyway, if you're a Muslim and fasting and doing religious observances, then may the divine Allah bless you with peace and harmony this Ramadan. So the rest of you, Buddhists might be wondering why I'm talking about that. Um, and It's interesting. I've been reading this book. It's called Common Ground Between Islam and Buddhism. And I'm not reading it because it's Ramadan. I'm reading it because I have time to catch up on my reading. And this, about, well, 2 Februaries ago, I was in Santa Fe for University Chaplains Conference. And I got to spend some time with a Muslim chaplain. And he was a nice guy, and he had an interest in Buddhism, and he had been reading that book, and he told me about it. And so I thought it was interesting. So I ordered it some time ago, and it's been sitting on my desk with the things to read when I get a chance to. So I've been reading that, and it just reminds me that religions are containers for truth. There are ways that we access the divine, the absolute, whatever you want to call that. And there's this saying in Zen, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. And it's kind of the same thing with religion. The practices and principles are expressions of our Buddha nature. They're examples of our Buddha nature at work. But there are ways to access that. They're not things to be clung to in and of themselves. And the Buddha, fairly uniquely in Buddhism, well, I'm not an expert on a bunch of other religions, so maybe it's in other religions too. But in Buddhism, the Buddha was very clear that the religion is not to be clung to, that it's a path, it's a method of crossing over the river. And so, the idea that there's one religion that is the only path to truth and things like that really doesn't fit very well with Buddhist thought. And I think the more I spend time with people who are really spiritually plugged in, regardless of how they identify, what religion they identify with, the more I'm convinced that there are multiple paths out of the valley. There's this saying that all paths lead up the same mountain. I don't agree with that necessarily, but I think all the paths lead out of the same valley, and that the view is pretty good from all the mountaintops. So basically I want to talk a little bit about truth today, what it means for something to be true in that spiritual sense. And being Buddhist, we talk about the Four Noble Truths and that sort of thing. So I want to talk about what it means for something to be true. And in politics or science or history or law, the idea of truth is actually kind of fluid. We think of it as a fact, as being something that's real tangible and unchanging and all of that. But historians are actually pretty slow to claim that something is fact, because they might find new information. And so history gets revised. What happened doesn't change, obviously, but our understanding of it changes as new things come to light. And, growing up where I did, and, the story of, I grew up in Texas, and the story of what happened between the settlers and the Indians, and what happened between the English speaking people who came down from the north and the Mexico and all of that kind of thing. Those stories changed since I was a kid. It was just kind of interesting that when that happens. But in a courtroom, attorneys produce evidence, and then they try to interpret that evidence to show a probability that something happened in a certain way. But a lot of times, somebody's sentenced to prison, and then new evidence shows up, and suddenly our understanding of the truth changes. Scientists don't use the term truth very much. They use words like theory, as in evolutionary theory, and laws, and the laws of physics. And those are ways of explaining what's objectively observed and predicting what will happen. So, if you point a rocket in a certain direction at a certain speed, it's going to get to Mars at a certain period of time, and that kind of thing. But just because the word truth is a little bit fluid, that doesn't mean that there aren't realities. And just because you don't call something a truth doesn't mean it's that it's okay to be ignorant of it. And that's true when you talk about spiritual matters. When I was a fellow student once asked Reverend Koyo Kabose when we were on a call together, said, "I'm not sure I believe in karma." And he said, "Why should I think the law of karma is true?" And Reverend Kabose said, "Well, you don't have to believe in the law of karma. You don't have to believe it's true. You don't have to believe the law of gravity either, but I wouldn't try to ignore its effects. So if you believe in karma or not, you're going to experience the results of your actions. Just like if you step off the top rung of the ladder, you're going to hit the ground. Even whether you believe in gravity or not, it's still going to affect you." And so when we talk about truth in a spiritual context, things can get kind of interesting. And the Buddha was very realistic about this. And, he had seen a number of gurus himself that he had trained with and learned what they had to teach and all of that, and then determined that their teachings didn't lead to liberation. And after his own awakening, he didn't rush right out and start teaching. He actually spent several weeks there on the shores of the river where he had become enlightened, just kind of moving from place to place and meditating and considering what he had awakened to and examining his new realization to make sure that it was really true and he hadn't overlooked something. And so as you read the teachings, you find a number of discourses where the Buddha calls into question what's true and what's not, and how to approach the idea of truth in a spiritual sense. So there's a famous sutra where this group of people called the Kalmas asked the Buddha to come and talk to them. And this tribe of people in northern India had seen many teachers, and they'd heard a lot of contradictory teachings. And they came to the Buddha and they said, "Look, this one guy shows up and he says what he considers to be the truth, and he disparages all the other teachers, and then he leaves. And the next guy comes in, he disparages the guy who was just here, gives a completely different account of what's true." He says, how do we know what's true? How do we determine what teaching is true, and how do we use that in order to live better? So, the obvious thing, I guess, would be for the Buddha to say, "Well, I'm a great enlightened person, rightly self-awakened, so it's okay if you believe me, that'll get you along okay." But that's not what he did. He didn't say, "If you hear it from me, it's true." There's sort of two parts of the teaching that he gave. And maybe one of these days I'll give a couple of really in-depth Dharma talks on this subject, but they basically told them first what not to go on. He said, don't rely on tradition. Don't rely on what the scriptures say. Don't go by rumors or surmise or axiom. Don't rely on what sounds true to you or accept an idea because you're comfortable with it. It makes you feel good. Don't go by someone's apparent ability or credentials, and don't go by the consideration, this teacher is my teacher. Now look, none of those things are necessarily wrong. Just because you hear a teaching from a teacher doesn't mean that you shouldn't believe it, or just because something's a tradition doesn't mean you shouldn't follow it. Traditions tend to develop because they're useful and helpful. Teachings get accepted over time because they're proven to work. And scriptures and axioms and things like that can be really useful sources of wisdom and guidelines for practice. And advice from someone who's been where you want to go is invaluable. But something's not true just because it sounds true or it makes you feel better to hear it. And it's not true just because I said it, or some preacher said it, or some famous teacher said it, or whatever authority, or because it's tradition or whatever. There are things that, get embodied in tradition probably for bad, not very good reasons. If you look at some of the holy books and their translations and so on, you'll see that things were kept or changed or adapted slightly because it was politically expedient to do it that way. There are things that you find in Buddhist cultures that probably really didn't have a whole lot to do with the Dharma. And that's true in other religions as well. So if we can't rely on those things, then where do we look to see if something is true? And so the Buddha gave advice on that. He said, if you determine for yourself that something leads to harm, don't do it. That's simple enough. If you do something and it leads to harm, then, don't do that again. But then he said, if a spiritual path leads to kindness, to compassion, to gratitude, to peace of mind, then you can count on it, you can rely on it. And so he told them that they should cultivate that. He was talking about the Brahma Viharas. They should cultivate goodwill, cultivate compassion, cultivate gladness in the good fortune of others, cultivate equanimity. And as long as they did that, then if there is an afterlife, this was a big part of what people were arguing about, these different teachers who came through. Some would say that, karma determined how you were reborn, and some said it didn't matter, and and so on. And some said there's no afterlife, and some said that there is. And so the Buddha said, well, if you do this, if you cultivate these things, if you cultivate these states of mind, then if there is an afterlife, and if what you do in this life affects your afterlife, then you're going to have a good rebirth. And if not, you're going to have a good here and now. So develop these things, and you'll get a good result from that either way. But the Buddha did give a little bit more detailed process for determining how to recognize the truth in a spiritual teaching. And I kind of like to work with this a little bit and encourage people to study this some. So the Buddha's stepmother, Mahapajapati, became the first woman to ordain. And so after she ordained, she stayed with the Buddha for a while at the monastery where he was. And she learned quite a bit and developed. And then she decided at some point that she wanted to go off and practice on her own, which monks and nuns typically did. They didn't stay where the Buddha was all the time. They would go spread out, and they would teach others, and they would hear other teachings from each other and that kind of thing. And so she went to the Buddha and she said, I think I'm ready to go off on my own. But she wanted to know how to recognize if a realization or a teaching was true or not. Now keep in mind, there were other monks that the Buddha had ordained who had come from other practices and other traditions. And there were other holy people out there, people who were ascetics, and there were priests who taught certain things and so on. And the Buddha didn't say they're all wrong, follow me and that's it. He respected these people. So part of this is that she would hear talks from others, just like we might hear a talk from a Christian or a Jewish person or an imam or whatever. We might get something out of that talk. So he didn't say dismiss all of that. He said, if you know that these qualities, whatever qualities you're being taught, lead to dispassion, not to passion, to being unfettered, not to being fettered, to shedding, not to accumulating, to modesty, not to self-aggrandizement, to contentment, not to discontent, to seclusion, not to entanglement, to persistence, not to laziness, to being unburdensome, not to being burdensome, then you may categorically hold this is the Dharma, this is the teacher's instruction. So let me unpack that some and kind of look at what we're talking about here. So the Buddha is basically saying there's some ways that you can put an idea or a teaching or a state of mind that arises or something like that to the test. So, when we start to practice, sometimes we'll have little awakenings, we'll experience something that seems very true to us. And you might not be at a monastery where you can ask somebody like me, hey, does this fit or whatever, but we can still test those things. And we have to be skeptical of what arises in our own minds too, right? Just because something sounds good to us or kind of resonates with us because it came up while we were meditating or whatever, doesn't mean that it has a whole lot of value. This conversation on social media with somebody who had read a couple of books and they were meditating and suddenly they considered themselves teachers. And they were posting stuff that was really kind of out there, and so I kind of asked them about where they were coming from and suggested that they might dig a little deeper into what they were learning. Anyway, so it's kind of, you can evaluate what comes up in your own heart as well as what you hear by using this. So the first one is dispassion. So what this means is clinging, attaching to stuff. Would a teaching or practice increase greed or anger or delusion? Does it encourage you to cling to things or actions or ideas that might turn out to cause harm to yourself or others? Okay. So if it arises in meditation or something that feels good and you want to keep doing that over and over again, or people will, it's very common when people start to practice a religion to suddenly be on fire for that religion. And, they will hang on to that, and that's the only true religion, and they want to push it on everybody else and all of that kind of stuff. They become very passionate about believing the way they believe. And that's really not what this is about. So we don't want to increase our attachments. We don't want to increase, animosity toward people who don't believe the way we do or whatever. So we don't want to think, well, this is the right way to chant this, or this is the right way to bow. There's a lot of things that people do different ways, and we don't need to hold on to any of that. So if it increases clinging, then it's probably not that valuable. If it helps loosen clinging, then it's probably good. So what about being unfettered? Are you hanging on to something that is not a true source of happiness? So there's an old saying, if you do what you always did, you always get what you always got. So if your path has you look at life differently and leads you away from habits that keep bringing you back to the cycle of stress, getting what you always got, then you're probably on the right track. If not, if it just kind of confirms what you already believe, which is already leading you to trouble, it's probably not true Dharma. You should be looking somewhere else. Does your spiritual practice encourage spiritual consumerism? In other words, there's this idea, the third one, to shedding, not to accumulating. There is such a thing as spiritual materialism. If you're collecting spiritual experiences rather than experiencing real growth, then you might want to consider whether or not your path is right or not. And it's common, you go to a retreat and you like to tell people about the retreats you went on and that kind of thing. But it should be, that's not the purpose, One year, right around Christmas time, I saw somebody had posted something on social media about how they had ordered a new timer and a cushion and a Buddha statue and, something else, bells and stuff like that. Could hardly wait till Amazon brought it to them so that they could start to practice. It's like, well, you don't need all that stuff to practice. Those are accumulations. What you need to practice is your mind and your breath. That's pretty much all you need, right? So the next one is modesty. If you're congratulating yourself on going to all the most famous retreats, or you're shopping around for the next big thing or whatever, or you see your practice as something to brag about, let go of that a bit, right? This practice is something to help you on your spiritual path. It's not another adornment for your ego. So watch that. Contentment. On your spiritual journey, are you often reminded of the beauty of the world in which you live and the abundance you enjoy, even when things aren't going the way you like? So things are not going the way most of us like right now, right? Because we're in this very weird time, this historically strange time, locked in and not making any money and all that kind of stuff. But we can still, if you're on the right spiritual path, you can still be reminded of the beauty of the world that you live in and what you have, even though things are not going the way you like. And so if your spiritual path is showing you that, then you're on the right track. Seclusion. You said it should encourage seclusion. So is your spiritual life lived in the company of a supportive community where there are others who have traveled the same path, who accept you as a fellow traveler, can non-judgmentally offer you guidance on the path while acknowledging your need to cultivate your own wisdom? And if that's the case, you're on your own path. Now that may not sound like seclusion, right? You said to seclusion, not to entanglement. If your spiritual path has you bound up with other people in a way where you have to have them in order to feel good, then you should question that. Excuse me. You know, the incense, not COVID-19, just the incense. There's on Netflix, there's a documentary right now about several parts, like 6-part documentary on a cult that got established in the U.S. in the 60s, 70s, continued on into the 80s, I guess. And I was thinking about this idea of cults, you know, a cult, one of the things that makes it a cult is that it deliberately entangles you in it. So you're not on the path unless you're so bound up in it that you can't get out, right? So your spiritual path should support you with a company with a community of people who are helping you on your path. With people who can serve as examples, can help you without judging you, non-judgmentally, offering you guidance and things like that, and acknowledge your need to develop your own wisdom. That doesn't mean that you don't need to hear teachings or that you don't need to practice the traditions or whatever. But wisdom is something that comes from within with help from these things. So your spiritual community should recognize and encourage that. And it should also help you with persistence. Your spirituality should encourage you to practice diligently. And at the same time, to challenge you to go deeper and be more authentic. So, you know, the Buddha would say, you should practice as if your hat is on fire. He said turban, but you know, same thing. We don't wear turbans. But you wear a hat. Practice like your hat's on fire. You wouldn't just let it burn. You'd take it off and put the fire out. And it's the same thing with our spiritual practice. We should be committed to it because sooner or later, we're going to get burned one way or another. We want to be ready for that. We want to prevent it as much as possible. But we also want to know how to transcend it, how to react in a way, or respond in a way to things that arise so that we minimize suffering. And so persistence and kind of spiritual resilience should go together, I think. If you practice diligently, it should enable you to live more fully, recover from difficulties more quickly, experiencing fewer difficulties and so on. And the Buddha said you should be unburdensome. In other words, you shouldn't require a lot of things. If your spirituality requires you to make demands on people around you, if they believe the way you do or practice the way you do or conform to your views, then you should maybe reconsider your paths. So again, that kind of goes back to that cultish idea, but also, you know, a lot of people get really hung up on the religion that they're practicing. And so, you know, they can't go to the family gathering at Thanksgiving without telling other people how they're on, you know, they're going to hell or whatever, right? We don't want to do that as Buddhists either. So, you know, you should be able to let other people live out their own karma. Because even if you look at any religion, you'll find that within the context of the religion, there's a lot of variation, not just between religions, but within religion. Buddhism is a great example of this. Pure Land and Zen and Tantric Buddhism and all that kind of stuff, all these different approaches to the truth. So we have to let people find the path that works for them, that, you know, and that may even change, probably will change over time as you practice. You'll find that there are things that maybe don't work for you so much anymore, or things that you want to move on to. I've done a lot of meditation practices that I never do now, but I'll teach them once in a while because I see where somebody needs them, because you develop to an extent that you don't really need that. So it looks to me like we have some questions coming up. So, and it occurred to me today that I should be able to read these on my phone instead of having to juggle the. So somebody says, I was majoring in cinema. I was highly stimulated, but at the same time overwhelmed because the things I was learning were so different. Sorry, from the conventional things that I was being taught. And yeah, a creative life is a good life, but it's going to challenge the way you see things. You want to be careful what you put in your mind. I don't tell anybody don't listen to any particular kind of music or watch anything or whatever. But look at how the media you consume affects you. Look at how, what you're doing might affect others and that sort of thing. And try to live a life that's aligned with your spiritual values to the extent that's possible. Do I feel that some traditions get too ritualistic with their practice? So I think the problem is not that a tradition is too ritualistic as much as that people will get too hung up on the rituals and see them as, instead of fingers pointing at the moon, see them as the moon. Do you know what I mean? A ritual practice in a community is a way that we can kind of physically express our shared values, our shared spirituality. So when you go to White Sands, everybody bows together. That's really powerful that we're doing that thing together. The chanting together, that really amplifies that. Being a part of the community and working together that way really does kind of express our Buddha nature in a way that being on our own might not. Human beings tend to develop rituals even outside of a religious context. I used to do triathlons. I don't look like it, but but back when I could still, my knee wasn't messed up and all of that kind of thing, I used to do triathlons. And I noticed that I had little rituals that I did before a race started. And I noticed that everybody else that I knew who had done triathlons very long had little rituals that they did. And it's not anything too elaborate, but putting your shoes a certain way, putting your, whatever clothes you're going to change into a certain way, and that kind of thing. And a lot of that, I think, is to prepare the mind for the tasks to come. And so it's the same thing when you're going to meditate. It's good, I think, to light a candle and some incense and do some bows or something like that. It prepares the mind for the training that you're getting ready to do. And when you're doing that with other people, it really resonates through the entire community. But you don't want to cling to that. I've seen people who, they go to a different Zen center than the one that they're used to, and they'll come out complaining about the way they chanted things or the translation that they use of the Heart Sutra or something like that. And you don't want to get hung up on that stuff. See them as tools. They're tools for awakening. They're not things to be clung to. Can I expand on the concept of liberation? So liberation in Buddhism has a lot of different meanings, depending on kind of the context and the school of Buddhism we're talking to. Let's talk about it at kind of the most basic level. And this is the level that I think most people approach Buddhism, most Westerners who come to Buddhism, are mostly looking for ways to experience less stress in their lives. And stress includes a lot of different things, everything from, grief and for a lost loved one, or serious illness, to being annoyed at work and that kind of thing, right? So there's a spectrum of that. So the first step in liberation is to learn what you cling to that brings you back to suffering and how to sever that fetter that keeps you coming back, right? And so the first step in liberation is to recognize that and start cutting loose those links, start breaking those links. So, ultimate liberation, I mean, the way the Buddha talked about it in his time, we're really talking about becoming an arahant. So the mind is completely purified of all fetters, anything that ties you to rebirth. Most of us, that's not really even what we're practicing for anymore. And in the Mahayana, we want to keep coming back until all beings are liberated. So you at least maintain the fetter that brings you back to a pure land instead of transcending, coming and going altogether. So, and awakening is a little bit different. It's sort of realizing. I mean, we talk about awakening in the sense of sort of the day-to-day sense of having an awakening experience. It's kind of a glimpse that there is something beyond our cycle of stress, and that there is something that kind of transcends the mundane. And so that's also liberating. The simplest way to put it is letting go of those things that bring you back to suffering. And in the ultimate sense, that's completely transcending coming and going. And so it's nirvana. That nirvana means unbinding, becoming liberated, no longer fueling the fires of existence and suffering. So we can talk about that more another time if you want. What should I do for someone who might be going through things different from my own? So that's a very broad question. So I'm not real sure what you mean by that. If you can come Thursday and talk about that a little bit more detail, because that's things different than, I mean, the first thing is you may not have to do anything for them at all. It depends. Who is this person? What's their relationship? Are they looking to you for help? Or do you just notice that they're suffering and want to do something to help them with that? And then if they're following a different spiritual tradition, you don't want to try to say, well, hey, you really ought to give that up and become a Buddhist or whatever. I mean, that's not what this is about. So, model for them what you can, number one. Number two, recognize that their karma is their karma. They have to live with that. And ask them. That's always helpful. Ask. If somebody comes to you for help, somebody comes to you and they're talking about how miserable they are. Sometimes they just want to talk. They just want to be heard, received, accepted. Sometimes they want you to help them solve a problem. So, kind of find out what they're coming for. So and I'm sorry, but many males particularly, when somebody comes and says, I'm dealing with a problem, we say, okay, here's how you fix that. But that's not always necessarily the best thing for someone. They might just want to be heard. And be careful of what the intentions are behind what you want to do. Sometimes we want to help people who really don't want our help. And we're doing it because we want to feel good about us, not necessarily because we want to help them. So the first step is really kind of look into what the needs of the situation are. So I think that's all the questions that I've gotten so far. Feel free, remember we do meet on Wednesdays for service and Dharma talk on YouTube. We meet on Thursdays on Zoom. Those are very conversational, relatively little structure, not much in the way of ritual, as you put it that way. We don't meditate or anything. We read something, and then I give a little backstory on it. We're reading from the Dhammapada. I give a little backstory on it, maybe a couple of insights, and then we talk about that, and then we talk about anything. So if you got questions like that, you want to get into a little bit more depth conversation, feel free to join us on Thursdays on Zoom. If you email me, I'll tell you how to get into the room. So thank you very much for joining me today. And I will do the dedication. Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, and offering flowers, candles, and incense, hearing the Dharma and training the mind, great merit is attained. We dedicate this merit to the great Master Shakyamuni Buddha, the all-pervading and everlasting three treasures, to the 16 guardians and all protectors of the Dharma and their relations throughout space and time, to all ancestors of this Sangha and all beings in the Dharma world. May penetrating light dispel the darkness of ignorance. Let all karma be resolved and the mind flower bloom in eternal spring. May the Dharma body maintain strength and health, and years of life be lengthened for all teachers of this community. May their vows be fully realized, and may they live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma. We pray for those suffering from violence, those who grieve for them, for all those living in oppression, for all who are in prison who should be free, for all refugees from violence, hunger, catastrophes, man-made or natural. We pray for the health and well-being of all those suffering from diseases of body, mind, or spirit, and all those working toward the healing of those afflictions. We pray for all those suffering from COVID-19, those grieving for those lost to this disease, and to those who are working to protect and treat them. At this time, we have members of our congregations, friends, and loved ones who suffer from cancer and other diseases, other members who are grieving for lost loved ones. We pray for them and send loving thoughts their way. May they be serene through all their troubles, and may we realize the enlightened way together. Sabe sata sadahantu avera sukha jivino katang punya phalang mahang sabe bhagi bhavantu te. May all beings always live happily, free from animosity. May all share the blessings that spring from the good we have done. So again, thank you for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you next Sunday, if not before.